Lonely rancher saved little twin girls. The next day, their mother arrived and changed his life forever. Wyoming Territory, winter of 1873. The first light of dawn stretched across the snow-drenched plains. Wind howled over the frozen grasslands, sharp as broken glass and constant as breath itself. The storm from the night before had swept the world clean. No hoofprints, no bird calls, no sound but the long whistle of wind slipping through stone like a funeral hymn. Paul Morgan rode slow atop his bay gelding, Storm, saddle leather creaking with each motion. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with frost gathering in the lines around his eyes. The rifle slung across his back moved with practiced familiarity. He was checking the western fence line, same as he did every morning, but today something was off. The quiet felt different, too tight, too full. Just as he was about to turn back toward the barn, he heard it. A scream, short, high, and cracked at the end, like a branch breaking. Paul sat up straight, heart thudding. Not an animal, not a coyote, a child. He held his breath, straining his ears. There, another sound, a sob, faint, as if the wind was trying to swallow it whole. Paul drove his boots into Storm's sides. Go, boy. This ain't the time to drag your hooves. They bolted up the rise, snow spraying behind like smoke from a fire. The wind slapped against his face, sharp with ice and urgency. The slope was treacherous, the trail barely visible. Twice, Storm's hooves slipped, but Paul kept pushing forward. The cries grew louder, thinner, then broke into sight. On the tree line, near a stand of frost-bitten pines, two small figures staggered through knee-deep snow. Little girls, twins, no more than 6. Wrapped in torn blankets, bare feet, bloodied, and blue from cold. And they were not alone. 2 prairie wolves, lean from hunger, circled with murder in their eyes. One wolf lunged forward. One of the girls tripped, falling face first into the snow. The other turned and threw herself over her sister, tiny arms flung wide in a useless shield. Paul felt something snap loose inside him. He swung off the saddle in a single motion, yanking his rifle free. But the wolves were smart. They split. One charged the girls, the other peeled off toward him, too far for a second shot. One bullet, one chance. He dropped to a knee, took aim, held his breath. The wolf charging the girls was a blur of fur and teeth, nearly on top of them. Paul fired. The gunshot cracked across the snowy basin like thunder in a church. The wolf dropped mid-lunge, body tumbling across the snow, streaking red behind it. The second wolf skidded to a stop, then growled and launched itself at Paul. Storm reared and whinnied, panicked. Paul had no time to reload. He threw the rifle aside and yanked the knife from his boot, just as the beast leapt. They collided mid-air. Paul hit the ground hard, rolled, felt the wolf's weight crash into him. Claws raked his coat. He thrust up with the blade, once, twice, until the body atop him went limp. Blood soaked into the snow. His breath came in ragged clouds. His arms trembled. But it was done. The prairie went still again, save for the wind. The girls hadn't moved, huddled together, eyes wide, shaking like leaves in winter. Paul stood and walked toward them slowly, crouching so he wouldn't seem so large. He unfastened his coat, spread it wide. "It's all right now," he said gently. "You're safe. I'm gonna get you home, I promise." They didn't speak, but they didn't run either. He wrapped the coat around their trembling bodies, pulling them in close. One of them clung to his shirt. The other looked up into his face, tears frozen on her cheeks. For the first time in years, Paul felt the weight of someone needing him. And he did not walk away. Paul lifted Daisy first, cradling her as her tiny fingers gripped his coat. June whimpered behind him, one foot twisted unnaturally beneath her. Her ankle was bruised and swelling fast. Paul returned and swept her into his arms. She cried out, her breath fogging the frigid air. Daisy reached out for her sister, but her arms were too weak. She collapsed gently against Paul's shoulder. Storm, the bay gelding, stood steady in the snow, sensing the urgency. He let out a low nicker, as if to comfort the girls. Snow flurried down in ash-like spirals through the gray dusk. Paul's cabin appeared like something out of a half-forgotten dream. Small, weathered, its stone chimney trailing a thin ribbon of smoke that promised warmth. Inside, Paul placed the girls near the hearth, where firelight flickered across their hollowed cheeks. He unfastened his coat, laid it out, and set the girls atop it, shielding them from the cold creeping up through the wood floor. June trembled violently, her ankle throbbing. Daisy's skin was pale, her fingers curled stiffly from cold. Paul poured milk into a battered tin cup, held it to the fire, then cooled the rim with his breath. He tipped it to Daisy's lips. She drank greedily, some spilling down her chin. He did the same for June, holding the cup until she could take it. He took Daisy's fingers between his rough palms, rubbing gently, coaxing the life back into her small hands. His touch was unexpectedly tender, like someone calming a frightened foal. When June winced, Paul knelt beside her, voice soft. "You're safe now, little one. I've got you." He fetched a bowl of warm water, salted it, and dipped a cloth. With quiet care, he cleaned June's ankle, wiping dirt and blood from the swollen skin. She gripped his thumb tightly as he wrapped it in clean linen. Daisy watched him in silence, eyes wide, not with fear now, but something closer to awe. This stranger's hands moved with quiet certainty. By nightfall, Daisy burned with a low fever. Paul stoked the fire and gently pulled her into his lap, wrapping them in a wool blanket. Her breath warmed his chest through the flannel. As he held her, memory crept in. His wife, her last winter, sick in this very cabin. He had thought he would never hold anyone again like this. He did not sleep. When June stirred near midnight, whispering, "Mama," Paul reached over and smoothed her hair. "I'll find her," he said. "I promise." Morning came pale and still. The fire had burned low, but Daisy's fever had broken. Their cheeks now had the faintest color. Paul soaked dry bread in bean broth, ladling it into chipped bowls. It was a clumsy meal, but warm, and the girls ate in silence. Then they began to speak. "Bad men," Daisy whispered. "Mother said to run," June added. "Fire. Wagon burned. Mother fell," Daisy said, her voice barely audible. Paul put down his spoon and leaned closer. "Is your mama alive?" he asked gently. Daisy nodded slowly. She was. That was all he needed. That afternoon, Paul strapped on his rifle and told them to lock the cabin door tight. Then he mounted Storm and rode back toward the woods. At the clearing, he found the wreckage, blackened wood, broken crates, scorched fabric. Not far from the site, a branch snagged a strip of torn dress cloth. Blood drops, frozen like red stones, marked the snow nearby. He followed a trail to the creek's edge. Footprints, uneven and dragging, led into the thicket. A woman had fled here. She had been hurt, but she had survived. For now, jaw tight, Paul turned toward home. As he reached the yard, the girls burst from the cabin and ran to him. June grabbed his leg. "Did you find her?" Paul knelt, his voice steady. "I found tracks. She's out there. And we're going to find her." Both girls began to cry. This time, not from fear, from hope, from relief. Late afternoon, the afternoon hung still, wind curling under the eaves like a whisper waiting to be heard. Inside the small cabin, Paul stirred a pot of oat porridge while Daisy and June sat wrapped in thick quilts by the fire. They had begun to smile again, their laughter hesitant but real, like small birds testing broken wings. Now and then, June called out, "Mr. Morgan," with a teasing lilt that made Paul pause mid-stir, a faint smile tugging at his lip. Then Storm cried out. It was not a hungry whinny, nor a startled snort. It was sharp, high-pitched, an alarm. Paul dropped the ladle, hand moving to the rifle resting near the door in one seamless motion. He stepped onto the porch, heart thrumming, eyes narrowing. The wind had picked up, dragging ribbons of dust and snow across the open field. Through the haze, he spotted a lone rider, A figure slumped in the saddle, barely upright. The horse staggered, its sides heaving, hooves clumsy on the hard ground. As they drew near, Paul saw it was a woman. Her dress was torn, the hem frozen stiff. Dried blood crusted the shoulder of her blouse. Hair clung to her cheek in dirty strands, eyes glassy beneath the caked dust. She did not see him until her horse halted at the broken gate. She tumbled sideways. Paul was there, in 3 strides, catching her before she hit the ground. Her voice was barely more than a cracked breath. "My girls, please, help." She did not know they were already inside. Behind him, the cabin door creaked. Daisy stepped out first, then froze. Her mouth opened, silent at first. Then came the scream. "Mama!" June limped out after her sister, both of them moving with sudden speed. Ruth, because it could only be her, lifted her head at the sound. Her body crumpled as the girls crashed into her arms. Knees hit the snow. Her hands clutched them to her chest, as though afraid they might vanish again. Tears streamed down her cheeks, streaking the grime, and she could only whisper, "My babies, my girls." They cried, all 3, the sound of it slicing through the cold and settling deep in Paul's chest. He stepped back, giving them space. It felt like watching something sacred, a reunion born not of luck, but stubborn love and sheer survival. Ruth looked up, through her tears. You saved them." Paul nodded once. For a moment, their eyes held, a glance heavy with things neither dared say. Gratitude, relief, maybe something else, quiet and uncertain. He helped her to her feet. Inside, Paul prepared a chair by the fire. Ruth could barely sit upright. Her hands trembled as she tried to hold the cup of tea he offered. The girls flanked her, one clutching her right hand, the other burrowed into her side. When she finally spoke, her voice was raw. "Our wagon was ambushed. A gang, they came out of nowhere, on the ridge, guns drawn, faces covered. They wanted gold, food, anything." She paused, blinking hard. "I tried to fight. They struck me, burned the wagon. I screamed at the girls to run. They chased us, dragged me off, but I slipped away while they argued over what they stole." Her voice cracked again. "I searched all night. All I found was blood, snow, no trail." Daisy pressed her face into her mother's arm. Ruth reached up to stroke her hair with a trembling hand. She turned to Paul. "You did not just save my daughters, you saved me." Paul shook his head. "I did what any man would do." But they both knew that was not true. Ruth swayed suddenly. Her face went pale. Blood soaked through the bandage on her shoulder, dark and spreading. She collapsed forward. Paul caught her before she hit the floor. "Mama!" Daisy cried. "Is she dying?" June whispered. "No," Paul said, lifting Ruth gently. "She's just tired and hurt, but she'll be fine." He carried her to his bed, laying her down with a care that surprised even him. He tucked a wool blanket over her, then turned to the girls. "She's safe now, you all are." And as he sat beside the bed, watching the girls curl up against their mother, Paul understood something he had not let himself believe in years. He was no longer just a witness to other people's lives. He was part of this one now, whether he asked for it or not. 2 days after the reunion, the morning light filtered softly through the frosted window panes. The snow had stopped sometime during the night, but the cold still clung to the air like a warning not yet spoken. Inside the cabin, a hush lay over everything, broken only by the slow crackle of the fire. Ruth stirred beneath the quilt. Her shoulder ached, but the pain was muted, wrapped in warmth and care. When her eyes opened, she saw her daughters, Daisy curled at the foot of the bed, June leaning against the chair with a blanket half draped across her lap, both asleep, peaceful at last. She shifted, and her hand brushed the thick bandage at her shoulder. Clean, snug, properly tied. She glanced toward the stove. There was a basin of water warmed by the fire, a folded cloth laid neatly beside it. "Did you do all this by yourself?" she asked. Paul, standing by the counter, cutting dry bread into small pieces, looked up and simply nodded. Ruth said nothing more, but her eyes lingered on him, softened. By late morning, the cabin began to hum with quiet life. Ruth insisted on helping with breakfast, though her body still moved slowly, each gesture careful. Paul let her stir the oats while he fetched more wood. The girls, finally well-fed and warm, chased each other in circles around the table, giggling. It was the first true laughter to touch these walls in years. Later, Paul worked on a section of the corral that had split during the storm. June and Daisy followed him outside, each carrying a small wooden mallet. He smiled at their enthusiasm, handing them rusty nails and pretending they were just as essential to the task as he was. Ruth stood in the doorway, shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She watched in silence as her daughters followed Paul across the snow, their laughter rising with the wind. Her eyes misted, but her lips curved in a smile. She had not expected to see her children smile again so soon, or herself. That evening, Paul rummaged through a trunk near the hearth. He pulled out an old, torn coat, worn from years of hard use, its collar frayed. He turned it in his hands, frowning, and moved toward the door. Ruth, seated nearby, mending a sock, looked up. "Let me fix that," she said softly. Paul paused. "It's not worth the trouble," he murmured. Ruth reached out for the coat. Nothing warm should go to waste. She took a needle and thread, began to stitch beneath the flicker of lamplight. Paul sat down across from her, not speaking. He watched her hands move, quick, sure, patient. For a long while, the only sound in the cabin was the rhythm of the fire and the pull of thread through fabric. The silence between them was not heavy. It was full of things neither of them could say yet, but the quiet itself felt like a bridge. Later that night, after the girls had been tucked into bed, Ruth sat by the hearth with Paul, holding a mug of warm water between her palms. "My husband died in a mine collapse 2 years ago," she said without preamble. Paul didn't interrupt. "I stayed in that town as long as I could, but work dried up. No one would hire a widow with 2 little girls, so I packed everything we had into that wagon. I thought we'd head west, start over, somewhere." Her voice wavered, but she steadied it. "They're all I have. Everything I do is for them." Paul leaned forward, elbows on knees. "You're stronger than anyone I've known." Ruth let out a brittle laugh. "No, I'm just a mother." They sat in stillness. This time, the quiet was not between them, but around them. The next morning, as Paul went to feed the horses, he stopped cold. A single hoofprint in the snow, fresh, not storms, leading toward the fence line and then vanishing. Inside the barn, the latch on the rear door had been loosened. Not broken, just tampered with. He found a faint footprint beside the shed, too large to be his, too deliberate. He returned to the cabin, face unreadable. Ruth noticed instantly. "What is it?" Paul hesitated, then answered honestly. "Someone's been here." Ruth went pale, her breath caught. "They're looking for me. They think I still know something." She swallowed hard, then met his eyes. "When they had me, I overheard them talking about a stash, gold they took from a town near the border. I did not mean to hear it, but they knew I had. They were going to kill me for it. Do you know where it is?" Ruth shook her head. "Not exactly. I only caught part of it, but they think I do." Paul looked toward the dark horizon beyond the cabin windows. "They'll come." He turned back to Ruth. "I'll handle it." But she and Paul both knew whatever came next would be worse than before. That night, when the girls were asleep, Paul checked every window latch, every door hinge. He cleaned his rifle slowly, methodically, replaced the bolts on the back door, hammered an extra plank over the kitchen window. Then he stepped outside, into the freezing dark, and looked back at the house. Inside, he saw Ruth curled around her daughters, all of them asleep under one blanket. He whispered, not to them, but to the wind, "I won't let them take this from me." And he meant every word. The snow melted slow in the days that followed, just enough to reveal patches of frozen earth beneath. Ruth and the girls stayed on, and the ranch, once a place of silence and routine, breathed with something new. Laughter, soft and childish, echoed off the fences and walls. Daisy and June tore through the yard in heavy boots, 2 sizes too big, chasing after chickens like wild ponies. Feathers flew in every direction as hens scattered, squawking into the crisp air. Paul leaned against the porch post, watching the chaos with a crooked smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The cabin, though unchanged, felt warmer, not just from the fire, but from the presence of life. Ruth found her place quietly. She swept the kitchen floor in the mornings, stirred pots in the evenings, stitched loose hems when the girls slept. Paul kept his distance at first, a man used to silence and grief. But they fell into rhythm, 2 people dancing around each other with soft steps. One morning, she reached over to button his shirt collar. Her fingers brushed his neck, light as a whisper. He froze, so did she. For a heartbeat, neither moved. In the afternoon, while repairing a crooked chair leg, Paul felt her hand rest on his shoulder. "It's been a long time since I've felt peace like this," she said. He didn't answer, just nodded. That night, Paul pulled something from an old drawer, a pair of wooden horses he'd carved from scrap pine, rough around the edges but charming. He'd spent 2 evenings shaping them in secret. He knelt down and offered them to the girls. "For you," he said. Daisy squealed, throwing her arms around his neck. June kissed his cheek without hesitation. Across the room, Ruth's breath caught. She pressed a hand to her chest, eyes glassy. Later, she folded napkins at the kitchen table, noticing the tattered tablecloth beneath them, faded, threadbare, but carefully mended now. She glanced at Paul. "I know this belonged to her," she said. "I'm not trying to take her place. I wanted to fix something." He looked down at the stitches. Her fingers had followed old lines, not replacing, just reinforcing. "I know," he said softly, but he did not move the cloth. One evening, after tucking the girls in, Ruth sat with the firelight on her face, the silence between them broken by a low murmur. "We're not staying, Paul, just until I'm strong enough, then we'll move on." He stood near the door, half-shadowed, a mug cooling in his hands. He said nothing. She did not look up. Outside, a gust rattled the windows. That night, Ruth curled into Paul's old coat, her back to the flames. Paul added another log to the fire and sat opposite her. "If we left," she said quietly, "would you miss us?" He hesitated. "I think the silence would be louder than it's ever been." Ruth lowered her gaze, and the fire between them seemed to burn brighter. Daisy had a nightmare just past midnight, calling out, "Daddy Morgan!" Paul was there in an instant, kneeling beside the bed, hand on her back. In the morning, June clung to his leg as he stepped out to check the pasture. Ruth stood by the sink, watching it all unfold. The girls had already chosen who they trusted, who they needed. "If we leave," she whispered to herself, "how do I explain to them why we're breaking their hearts?" That evening, Paul found the chicken coop missing one hen. A trail of feathers led to the edge of the brush, where he spotted faint tracks. A boot print too large for Ruth or the girls. He checked the watershed. The door was ajar. He circled the barn and found something tucked beneath a snow-covered bush, a worn saddlebag, not his. Inside the cabin, he said nothing. Ruth saw the worry in his eyes, the way his shoulders tensed when the wind howled against the shutters. She wanted to ask. He wanted to tell her, but neither did. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Paul stepped outside into the cold. The stars were hidden behind low clouds. He carried his rifle and moved along the edges of the house. Near the rear post, just before the woods thickened, he saw it. A footprint, deeper than the others. Fresh, heavy. Beside it, a frayed piece of rope, sheared clean through. He crouched, fingers brushing the dirt, eyes narrowed. "They're getting closer," he murmured. He stood, turned to look at the cabin. Warm light flickered through the curtains. Ruth and the girls were safe, sleeping. But Paul knew the night would not last forever. The wind had been howling since dusk, carrying the promise of danger on its breath. Snow fell heavy and fast, blanketing the barn, freezing the window panes, seeping through every wooden seam of the old cabin. Paul stood by the fire, his eyes fixed on the door. Ruth tightened her shawl and held Daisy and June close. No one spoke, but they all knew. Tonight, they would come. Paul checked the Winchester again, his grip steady, his face grim. Ruth barricaded the barn doors from inside, dragging a sack of grain in front of the cabin's entrance. Daisy whispered, "Mama, I'm scared." Ruth bent down, pressing her hand over her daughter's heart. "We have each other, and we have Mr. Paul. We'll be all right." Around midnight, the silence broke. Hooves shattered the storm's rhythm, thudding like war drums. Paul leaned to the window, squinting through the frost. 4 riders emerged from the storm, their shadows long on the snow, torchlight flickering like specters. One man bellowed, "We've come to reclaim what's ours. Hand over the woman, or we'll burn you all to ash." Ruth stepped forward. "If I go, you and the girls will be safe." Paul didn't flinch. "If you go, none of us walk away. Stay inside. I promised the girls nothing would happen to their family." When one of the men advanced, Paul fired. The shot hit the torch dead on, snuffing its flame. A chorus of shouts followed. Bullets tore through the window, splinters flying. The fire flickered wildly, casting warped shadows across the walls. Outside, one of the riders crept toward the barn with a flask of oil. Ruth spotted him through a side window. She grabbed the revolver Paul had given her days ago. Her hands trembled, but her aim was true. Crack! The bullet struck the man's leg. He fell with a howl, crashing into the snow. Inside the cabin, June and Daisy watched wide-eyed, witnessing their mother stand tall in the face of fear. Something shifted in their gaze. Pride, awe. Then came the worst of it. The back door slammed open. The leader burst through, slamming into Paul. They crashed into the table, knocking over the boiling pot. Steam hissed into the air. The man drew a knife and drove it deep into Paul's side. Paul grunted, stumbling, his arm soaked in blood. "Paul!" Ruth screamed, grabbing the iron poker. With all her strength, she swung. It cracked across the man's skull. He reeled. Paul lunged up, fist clenched, and struck the final blow. The man collapsed, motionless. Outside, the remaining 2 fled into the darkness, hooves vanishing into the night. Snow kept falling, but it was quiet now, peaceful. Inside, Ruth helped Paul to a chair, her hands red with his blood. She choked back tears. "You are not leaving us. Do you hear me?" Paul coughed, his face pale. "I haven't fixed the roof yet. Can't leave." That was when the girls ran to him. June threw her arms around his neck. "Mr. Paul, you're our hero." Daisy leaned in close, whispering, "I want to stay here, with you, forever." Paul froze, not from pain, from something deeper. Ruth watched them, a softness overtaking her face. Something unspoken passed through her eyes. Paul Morgan, the man who once only spoke to horses and fences, had become a home. And for the first time in a long, long while, none of them felt lost anymore. The storm had passed, leaving a silence thick with ash-gray snow and breathless morning light. The cabin smelled of gunpowder, blood, and wood smoke. Ruth sat beside Paul, carefully peeling back the bandage on his side. His skin was bruised, torn, but the bleeding had slowed. "You're lucky," she whispered, dabbing the wound with warm water. "Another inch, two arg." He winced, half smiling, but it wasn't. She paused, then looked at him, truly looked. "You stood between us and death, again." Paul shook his head. "You saved me, you and that poker of yours." Ruth chuckled softly, but her eyes welled with tears. "I thought I was going to lose you. I've lost enough already." Her voice broke on the last word. Paul reached for her hand, calloused fingers closing gently around hers. "I'm not going anywhere," he said quietly. "Not if you still need me." Just then, tiny footsteps padded across the floor. Daisy and June, wrapped in their shared blanket, climbed into the space between them. Daisy, her voice muffled by the blanket, asked, "Mr. Paul, can you be our family now?" June added, "Like a real daddy?" The question hung in the air, soft as breath, but heavy as a promise. Paul's throat tightened. He looked from the girls to Ruth, unsure how to answer. Ruth didn't speak. She just smiled, a soft, tearful smile that said everything. Paul cleared his throat. "I don't know what kind of daddy I'd be, but if you'll have me, I'd sure like to try." The girls beamed, wrapping their arms around his middle, careful not to touch the bandage. Ruth leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice warm and low. "Then it's settled. You're stuck with us now." For a long moment, they just sat there, 4 hearts, 1 quiet cabin, and a world of hurt slowly knitting itself into something new. Outside, the sun broke through the thinning clouds, casting golden light across the snow-covered land. It touched the rooftop, the old fence, the burned-out lantern still swinging on the porch. Inside, a family began again, without ceremony, without vows, just shared silence, healing hands, and the unspoken truth that sometimes love walks in through the back door, carrying a scar and a second chance. Spring came slow but sure, melting the last of winter's grip off the prairie grass and loosening the frost from the fence posts. The cabin, once a silent shell, now hummed with life. Ruth stayed. Not out of necessity, not out of fear, but because when she looked at Paul, she saw more than safety. She saw a partner, a steady hand, a man whose quiet soul had become the foundation of something whole. Paul built a new bed, broad, sturdy, carved from pine he cut himself. Daisy and June squealed when they saw it, jumping atop the mattress like it was a ship set for adventure. Their laughter echoed through the cabin walls like a hymn of belonging. Out back, Ruth worked in the dirt, turning hard ground soft with her hands. She planted carrots, turnips, and beans, humming the same lullaby her mother once sang. Paul watched from the fence line, his heart catching every time she tucked a stray curl behind her ear with that same grace he remembered from the firelight. Some evenings, they all sat on the porch. June would braid Ruth's hair. Daisy would nestle beneath Paul's arm. A book on her lap she insisted on reading aloud. Ruth would glance over, catching Paul smiling with his eyes closed, just listening. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the cottonwoods, Paul and Ruth stood side by side on the porch. The girls chased fireflies in the yard, their giggles weaving through the breeze. Ruth leaned her shoulder against his. "You ever think this was always waiting for us?" Paul looked out at the land, wide, wild, and finally at peace. "No," he said softly, "but I thank God it found us anyway." They stood there a while longer, not needing more words. Because some love stories are not born of lightning strikes or loud deruthtions. Some are built, plank by plank, day by quiet day, forged in storms and sealed in silence. In the heart of the Old West, where danger roamed and loss was common, one man's solitude met one woman's fierce will, and from that, a home rose. Not just a house of logs and nails, but a place of second chances, little hands, and the kind of love that grows even in hard soil. Paul Morgan was no longer a man alone, and as the fireflies danced and the wind kissed the wheat, he knew he had everything he never thought he deserved. A family, a future, a forever. If that story stirred something deep in you, if it made you believe, even for a moment, that love can rise from the ashes of hardship and bloom where bullets once fell, then don't let it end here. Hit that hype button if Paul, Ruth, and those brave little girls found a place in your heart. And subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more unforgettable tales of romance, redemption, and resilience across the American frontier. Because out here, in the dust and silence, love still rides, and we're just getting started.